Welcome to La Neta. I am Ben Waddell. Today we are talking about migration and violence in Mexico. Now you might find yourself wondering, what possible relationship could exist between migration out of Mexico and violence in the communities across the country? One of the things that we know for sure is violence has been going up in Mexico over the last decade. But migration has also been high for several decades in Mexico. And so it makes sense to think about what potential relationship could be existing between those two variables. So that's what we'll be diving into today. Again, this is La Neta. What we do in La Neta is we put facts on the table and we try and understand issues like violence in Mexico or migration to the United States by looking at the cold-hearted facts. And so today, we're looking at the relationship between those two things. Massive violence in Mexico amidst large migration towards the United States. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so we've talked about this extensively. We know the numbers. Migration in Mexico for the last several decades has been extremely high. In fact, Mexican migration to the United States represents the largest movement of people to the United States ever. And yet, Mexican migration has been falling in recent years. And so we can look at this by looking at research from the Pew Center. Now, if we look at this, annual immigration from Mexico to the United States from 1991 to 2010 has actually been going down since about the year 2000. What that means is the rate at which people are leaving Mexico to the United States is lower today than it was last year and is lower than it was the previous year, and so on and so forth. And yet, if we look at this, what we also know is that Mexican migration continues to be important. There's still hundreds of thousands of people that come from Mexico to the United States every single year. And so this question begs to be asked. As migration has continued to rise in Mexico, has there been a relationship between that movement and the violence that we've seen within the country? Violence in Mexico is at historic highs. When we look back to the Mexican Revolution of 1910, obviously violence was higher then. But since then, there has never been a period in which violence has been so high as it is right now in Mexico. Quite literally, thousands of people are dying every single year as a result of the narco violence that's taking place in Mexico throughout the country. When we look at this, since 2006, when the country declared a war on drugs, over 234,000 people have lost their lives in that conflict. And that number continues to go up every single day. In fact, 2020 is on the record one of the more violent years in Mexican history. 2019 was the most violent in recent memory. 2018 was the most violent before that, and so on and so forth. And so every single year, new records are being broken in terms of violence. And in addition to the more than 200,000 people that have been killed as a result of the violence, there's another almost 40,000 people that have simply disappeared during this time period. And so it's fair to say that violence in modern Mexico is nearly as high as it has ever been. And yet, we don't know the full causes of that violence. Naturally, cartels are part of that. But I want to focus in on the social structure that would lead people or encourage people to participate in cartel business or cartel violence as a means of better understanding the actual root causes of violence in places like Mexico. And so to do that, we're going to look at something that criminologists don't typically look at. We're going to look at the relationship between mass migration and violence in modern Mexico. So let's go ahead and dive into that. Okay, so what do we know about the potential relationship between migration out of Mexico and rising violence rates? Well, the first thing we know is that when people leave Mexico and resettle in large cities across the United States, they contribute to lower violence rates in those spaces. Across the board in the United States, where there is more foreign-born density, that is where there are more migrants living, violence goes down. Homicide rates in the years following migrants resettling actually are lower, right? And so there's this negative relationship between immigration and violence in large cities across the United States. Well, that would lead us to wonder what happens when migrants return. If immigrants actually contribute to lower rates of violence in the United States, then we'd suspect when they go back to Mexico, they should also contribute to lower rates in Mexico. And that's in fact what my colleagues and I have actually found across the country. In Mexico, where there are more return migrants, in the following years, there is less violence. So return migrants appear to contribute to lower rates of violence as well. And all of this begs the question, well, if immigrants leaving Mexico and resettling the United States leads to lower violence rates there, and immigrants returning to Mexico and resettling in the places they came from in Mexico leads to lower violence rates there, what happens to the communities that people are leaving from? Does violence go up? And that's actually the question that we're looking at here. And the answer to that question is yes. My own research and other research in the field demonstrates that where migrants leave more frequently, we actually see higher rates of violence in Mexico. And this makes sense for a number of reasons. And let's jump into some of those. So why might we suspect that migration or people leaving communities would contribute to higher rates of violence within those communities? Well, the first reason has to do with inequality. When migrants leave a small town in Mexico or even an urban neighborhood, they tend to resettle in places like the United States or other parts of the developed world like in Europe. And eventually, as they settle into a job and start making money, they send money back home. That's called a remittance or una remesa. As remesas or remittances start flowing in, small percentages of families within those communities receive that money. So that money goes from a developed country like the United States to a small community in Mexico where a small percentage of that community receives the actual benefit of the remittance. Now, the remittance is spent within small businesses and other parts of that community, and it has a trickle-down effect within the community, therefore. But it doesn't substantially improve the well-being of the majority of the community. So a small percentage of the community starts to become much better off in terms of social economic standing. And that means that all of a sudden, between the majority of the community and the small minority that's receiving consistent remittances, there is this rising inequality. Inequality, we know, as researchers, we know that inequality contributes to violence. Where there's large inequality, there is higher levels of violence. That is why in Latin America, the most unequal region in the world, we see some of the highest violence rates outside of war-torn nations in the world, right? So violence is crime and violence is extremely high in Latin America as a result of high inequality. So remittances contribute to that inequality. Remittances also contribute to less government. Where money is flowing in from abroad to small communities, local governments see a reason, or at least an excuse, to pull away from those communities. And so there's less pressure from local citizens, because they're receiving remittances from abroad, to focus on pressuring the local government for action. Instead, they pressure their family members abroad. If somebody gets hurt, or if there's a need to rebuild a bridge or a road, migrant communities or communities where migrants come from will oftentimes lobby in Chicago or lobby in Los Angeles with people that have left the community so that they can send more money back home to help them with their projects, right? And so as a result, local government moves away from what is its traditional business of taking care of the public projects that people need within those communities. Now, another thing that takes place is as young people watch migrants leave and get ahead in life, and they look at local people that have gone through the education system, they see that they're not getting ahead in life, they make the logical decision to pull out of education sectors and think about getting to the United States. Now, some people ultimately make it to the United States, but the vast majority don't. And so that means a lot of people are on the outside looking in. They're unable to access meaningful education within their communities, but they're also unable to access the prosperity that would come from migrating abroad. And so they're left in communities with the prosperity of remittances, which allows some people to get ahead. And they see that, and they would like to obtain that, but they're unable to. And so it creates the perfect recruiting class for narcos or cartels within the region. And so what we see within migrant communities is a situation in which young people are oftentimes left on the outside looking in, trying to think of ways to get ahead in life as migrants have, or as people working for cartels have. And so the logical decision, if you can't join the migrants abroad, is to join the cartels at home. And so what we see is the massive movement of people out of communities contributes to a social environment in which violence would be more likely, because more people are incentivized to join cartels or organized crime within those communities. Okay, so this is La Neta, and as you know, with every single episode, you get a story. Today's story is about a man named Rodrigo. I met Rodrigo many years ago, back in 2015, in southern Guanajuato. Rodrigo had been a migrant in the United States for almost 10 years. He lived in Texas and other parts of the country. And he had come back to Guanajuato, to his home state, because he wanted to raise a family. And he didn't want to be split from his family. And so he started working for the local municipality. He started working for the local government. So when I came across Rodrigo, he was already working for the municipal president for 2 or 3 years. And so we started talking about this potential relationship between migration and crime across Mexico. And he said, without knowing any of the research on this issue, pretty much everything I've already told you. He said, look, what happens is people see the monetary success of migrants abroad. They look around themselves and they say, where can I access that success? How can I access it? How can I do as well as Juan or Silvio or whoever it is that's left from the community? Right? And he said, as people look towards models for success, they see two things. They see the migrants and they see the cartels. And if you can't join one, you join the other. And if you can't join the other, you join the other one, right? And so on and so forth. And so young kids want to migrate because it is the rite of passage. It is a cultural way of getting ahead in small communities across thousands of small localities or municipalities in Mexico. But if you can't do that, he said, the next best business in town is the cartel, because the government's not providing enough jobs for people. Education's not preparing you well enough to be able to insert yourself into the national labor market and make enough money to, feel as if you're stable in life. And so the next best business in town is the cartel. And unfortunately, as it's become more difficult for people to migrate, Rodrigo told me, more and more young people are joining up with the cartels. And in the long run, that contributes to rising violence in Mexico. All right, so remember Rodrigo when you think about this relationship, because his life helps connect the dots between mass migration and violence in Mexico. Rodrigo was a migrant. He left. He helped his family get ahead, but he also returned. And that's important because since he's returned, he's been trying to help his community get ahead. He used the lessons that he learned abroad, the language skills and the know-how, the human capital that he gained in working in the US, and he's contributed to his community by implementing those things within his home community. He demonstrates the degree to which return migration helps us understand reductions in violence in Mexico. But he also, his story, helps us understand why immigration or people leaving a community might contribute to rising rates of violence out of places like Mexico. Okay, so this brings us to La Neta, the truth. This episode is focused on the relationship between migration and violence in Mexico. Now, I've talked about a story in the case of Rodrigo. I've talked about some of the research on this issue, but I also want to give you a sense from the perspective of a drug lord why this relationship might exist. So for this, I'm going to turn to a short video, a short clip from a video from La Tuta, who is now dead, but was a famous drug lord in Michoacan, Mexico, and he ran a group called Los Caballeros Templarios. And so we're going to listen in to La Tuta and see how he explains this economic relationship between migration and violence in Mexico.
Números, no me interesan los números ni me pongo a hacerlos, porque tú has visto que casi todo lo regalamos.
¿Cuánto le paga a estos muchachos?
¿Cuánto ganas tú?
15 al mes.
¿Cuánto ganas tú?
12.
¿Tú?
Yo 25, 30.
¿Tú?
No sé.
Depende de lo que hagan los muchachos. Hay muchachos que ganan 100. Depende de su función. ¿Entiendes?
So as La Tuta explains, there is an economic incentive to participate in groups like his. He is providing a service to communities, as he puts it. He's raising money through drug trafficking, but the town and the people support him and the people work for him because he's bringing something to that town that they otherwise wouldn't have, which is economic prosperity. Okay? So when we think about this relationship between migration and violence, we have to think of people like Rodrigo, we have to think of people like La Tuta, and we have to think about the potential logic that exists. And this brings us to La Neta, the larger point, the larger truth. And La Neta this week, in this episode, is that social structure matters. When we want to try and understand something like mass violence in Mexico over the last 10 to 15 years, we have to think about the ways in which social structure has shifted over the last several decades and has led to a social environment, to a society that would be prone for this type of violence. And what we see over the last 30 to 40 years is a massive social shift in Mexico. A shift of millions of Mexicans abroad to countries like the United States, where they have gone to try and access prosperity. Now, unbeknownst to those individuals, in leaving their country, Mexico, they've left behind a social environment that is ripe for violence and conflict. And that is the relationship that we see today. A relationship between people leaving a country through migration to access voice and access the ability to leverage prosperity in their own lives on their own terms through migration. But we also see this absence that them leaving, right? This absence or this void that they leave behind them that creates a social structure, a situation in which violence becomes extremely likely. That's la neta. And that brings us to the third law of migration. The third law of migration, similar to Newton's law, is that for every migrant act, there is an equal and opposite social reaction. When we think about mass migration, we have to think about the potential opposite consequences as well. Migration is an act that brings many people prosperity, but there is an opposite reaction that takes place as well. When people leave a country like Mexico, they access social mobility and prosperity abroad. In fact, in the 21st century, there is perhaps nothing that can bring you more prosperity in the developing world than migrating to a highly developed country like the United States. Migration is the best bridge to social prosperity in the world right now. And yet, when you migrate, you leave behind a social structure that is more prone to violence because you contribute through sending remittances to inequality within that community, and you leave the community without the ambition and the human capital that you would have brought to that community, right? And so you are an agent of change in a different community, the community you migrate to. But within your community, there is now less access to ambition, to human capital, and to people willing to push for change. And so as a result, in Mexico, over the 21st century, what we see is that as migration increases, violence also increases in the towns and communities that people left. That's La Neta for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, and I hope you tune in for future episodes as well.